You have been in this conversation before. Nothing about it was aggressive. No one raised their voice. No one interrupted you, at least not obviously. It was polite. It was calm. It might have even felt productive at the time. But afterward, something felt off. You walked away and realized you never actually said the thing you wanted to say. The conversation moved, but you didn't move it. Someone else did. And you can't quite explain how. There was no argument, no confrontation, no moment where someone said, "No, we are not talking about that." It was subtler than that. The topic shifted gently. Your point was acknowledged but not engaged with. The energy in the room reorganized around one person's direction. And by the end, you were responding to their frame, their priorities, the version of what the conversation was about. Not because you agreed, but the flow had already been decided before you realized it was happening. If this sounds familiar, you are not imagining it, and it is far more common than most people think. I'm Dinesh Kumar, author and podcaster, exploring psychology, technology, and how we make sense of modern life. This is the DK Talks. The misconception about control. When most people think of someone controlling a conversation, they picture something obvious: a loud voice, someone who talks over others, someone who dominates the room with force or volume. And that does happen, but that is not what this episode is about. Because the most effective form of conversational control is almost never loud. It is quiet, it is measured, and most of the time it is invisible to everyone in the room, including sometimes the person doing it. Real control doesn't announce itself, it doesn't need to. It works by shaping the space, what gets discussed, what gets dismissed, what feels acceptable to say, and what quietly drops off the table without anyone noticing it was removed. The kind of control doesn't look like power, it looks like composure. It looks like someone who just happens to be calm, articulate, and always slightly ahead of the conversation. And because it doesn't look like control, most people never name it, they just feel the effect. A strange sense of being guided, a big feeling of being smaller than they were before the conversation started. Not because anything aggressive happened, but because something subtle did. Conversational framing. Here is where it starts to become more specific. Every conversation operates inside a frame. A frame is not the topic, it is deeper than that. It is the set of unspoken rules that define what the conversation is really about, what is considered relevant, what is considered reasonable, what is treated as important, and what is quietly treated beside the point. Most of the time, people don't choose the frame consciously. It is just forms naturally from the context, the relationship, the setting. But some people set the frame not by declaring it, not by saying here is what we are going to talk about, but by how they open, by what they respond to and what they don't, by the questions they ask, by what they treat as obvious. For example, someone brings up a concern at work, they feel overlooked, they want to talk about it, but the other person responds with, "I think the real issue is priorities right now." That is a reframe. The original concern, feeling overlooked, has not been addressed, but it has been replaced. And it was done calmly, without disagreement, without saying your concern doesn't matter. It was simply moved past. And now the conversation is about priorities, not because that was more important, but because the one person redirected the frame and the other person followed it without realizing the shift had happened. This is how conversational control works at its most basic level, not through force, through framing. Whoever sets the frame tends to control the outcome, and most people never notice the frame was set. They just operate inside it. Emotional regulation has power. That is something else that gives certain people quite authority in conversations. And it is not confidence, it is not charisma, it is not even intelligence. It is emotional regulation. The ability to stay calm when the conversation gets tense, to pause when others are rushing to fill silence, to remain steady when emotions around them are rising. This sounds simple, but the effect it has on the people around them is significant. When one person in a conversation stays emotionally neutral while other persons become reactive, something shifts in the room. The calm person start to feel like the center of gravity, not because they are right, not because they are in charge, but because the brain reads emotional steadiness as authority. This is not a conscious decision, it is automatic. When your nervous system detects that someone around you is regulated and composed, it assigns them a kind of social weight. They feel stable, trustworthy, in control. And in contrast, anyone who is more emotionally expressive start to feel unfairly less credible, more emotional, less grounded, easier to dismiss. This is not about who is actually right. It is about how the brain assigns credibility based on emotional signals. And the person who stays the most regulated often becomes the person whose version of reality the room defaults to. Not because they earned it with better arguments, but because the nervous system communicated something the room responded to without realizing it. Selective validation and withholding. There is a quieter mechanism that operates alongside all of this. And it has to do with what a person chooses to acknowledge and what they choose to let pass. In most conversation, people are doing something beneath the surface that they are barely aware of. They are looking for validation, not a grand validation, not praise, just small signals that say, I hear you, that makes sense, go on. A nod, a reaction, a follow up question, even just a shift in attention. The signals keep the conversation flowing. They tell the speaker you are on solid ground. Now, when someone withholds those signals, something interesting happens. The other person starts to adjust. They rephrase, they soften the point, they look for a version of what they are saying that might land better. They begin editing themselves, not because they were wrong, but because the feedback loop went quiet. And when the validation does come, when the other person finally nods, engages, agrees, it feels like a relief. That relief is powerful because now the speaker has learned without being told which version of their thoughts gets approval, and they start leaning toward that version. This is not necessarily deliberate. Most people who do this are not consciously withholding, but the effect is same. The flow of validation, when it is given, when it is held back, quietly shapes what is said and how it is said, and what slowly disappears from the conversation altogether. Control without intention. This is an important part of the picture because it would be easy to hear all of this and assume we are talking about manipulators, people who are calculating, deliberate, strategic in a cold way. And sometimes this is the case, but most of the time it is not. Most people who control conversations don't know they are doing it. It is not a plan, it is a pattern. Often it is a learned behavior. Someone who grew up in an unpredictable environment may have learned very early that controlling the emotional temperature of a room was a way to feel safe. Someone who was often dismissed may have learned that setting the frame early was the only way to be heard. Someone who experienced chaos may have developed a need for conversational order that now shows up as quiet staring. This doesn't make the impact less real. If you're on the receiving end, it still feels the same. But it does change the interpretation, because the line between emotional intelligence and control is not always clear. Someone who reads the room well and someone who manages the room quietly may be using the same skill, just pointed in a different direction. One is awareness, the other one is influence, and sometimes the person doing it cannot tell the difference themselves. Why this feels draining? If you have spent time around someone who operates this way, whether they intend to or not, you already know the feeling. You don't feel attacked, you feel tired. And that tiredness is hard to explain because nothing obviously happened. There was no argument, no insult, no visible conflict, but something was working underneath. Here is what is actually going on. When you're in a conversation where the frame keeps shifting beneath you, where the validation is inconsistent, where someone else's calm sets the emotional baseline, your brain is doing extra work. It is tracking signals, adjusting your tone, monitoring the reactions, editing your words in real time. You're not just having a conversation, you are managing a conversation without being asked to, without choosing to. And this creates a cognitive load. The same kind of load you feel when you are in an unfamiliar environment where you don't quite know the rules. You are spending mental energy not on expressing yourself, but on navigating someone else's frame, and that is exhausting. Over time, it can also create self doubt, because when you repeatedly leave conversations feeling like your points didn't land, your presence didn't matter quite as much as someone else's presence, you start to wonder if the problem is you. Maybe you are not articulate enough, not confident enough, not sharp enough. But the problem was never your ability, it was the structure of the conversation. And that structure was not neutral, it was shaped quietly by someone else. Reframing the experience. So, what do we do with this understanding? Not fix it, not fight it, not learn to win conversations, just see it. Because what most people experience around conversational control is not a confusion about the other person, it is the confusion about themselves. Why didn't I say what I wanted to say? Why do I always feel smaller in that room? Why do I walk away feeling like I lost something? Those questions assume the problem is internal, but often it is structural. You are operating inside someone else's frame. Your responses were being shaped by patterns you didn't choose and didn't see. And once you recognize that, something shifts, not in how you behave, but in how you interpret that happened. You stop blaming yourself for not performing well in a space that was quietly tilted. This is not about labeling people as controllers. It is not about becoming suspicious of every calm person in the room. It is just about seeing a pattern that was always there but never had a name. And when something has a name, it loses a small amount of its power. Not all of it, but enough to change the experience. I think a lot of people walk away from certain conversations carrying a weight they can't explain. They replay what was said, they wonder what they should have done differently. They feel unsettled but can't point to a reason. And because there is no obvious cause, they turn inward. They assume the problem is them. But sometimes the problem is not you. It is that the conversation was never on a level ground. It was slightly tilted from the beginning. Not because someone was cruel, not because someone was scheming, but because one person, consciously or not, was setting the frame, holding the emotional center, and quietly shaping the flow of the room. And everyone else was just adjusting to it. This is not a manipulation in most cases, but it is not a neutral either. It is a kind of conversational gravity, and once you can feel it, you stop confusing its effect with your own shortcomings. You don't need to push back, you don't need a strategy, you just need to see it clearly. Because clarity is what keeps you from walking away wondering what went wrong. when nothing went wrong. The conversation just had a shape, and now you can see it.